Chapter 10. Players. Caleb would say no more on the subject, his gaze distant. "One thing at a time," he said. "Firstly, I'll be needing my pack. It's still back in the clearing, a little ways off." He stood slowly, groaning, then slipped off the branch with a casual step. Kedra craned her neck over to see, but he was already descending rapidly, as easily as she would a staircase. She gulped, then turned to Adrian. "Time to go," she said encouragingly, as much to herself as to him. He nodded solemnly. There had been trees all around her aunt's house, which she had taken pleasure in climbing when no one was watching. Making her way down from the daunting height, she reflected that this was a simple case of too much of a good thing. Each branch's mild creaks and sways felt distinctly less charming than it would have over a small drop over a flower bed. Adrian, for his part, followed her with ease. She had briefly worried about how she would get him down, but he seemed rather at home, and much more concerned with staying close to her than he was with the abyss below. It was actually rather reassuring. Slowly, carefully, the pair descended from their treetop perch. Caleb awaited at the bottom, bag slung over one shoulder, eyebrow cocked. "I suppose having a few cracked ribs won't be what slows us down," he said, amused. Kendra blushed. The dust cloud had settled around them now. At the center of the courtyard, Kendra now had a moment to properly consider the marble statue she had passed during the pursuit. From behind, it was lumpy and shapeless, but at this angle it resolved into a roughly humanoid shape, kneeling at rest. What she had seen was merely its expansive back, thick-set and behemoth. It was in truth quite carefully wrought, even lovingly, a work of untold days of toil. From the front, it was clear that it was a woman, patience and compassion in her face, an azure stone set in her single, polished eye. Kendra glanced back at the fallen hall, and incongruously she rather hoped that the Cyclops was all right in there. Caleb had also paused to study it, scribbling quickly into a small leather-bound notebook. At her notice, he blew hurriedly over the ink, then closed it with a snap. "We should put some distance between us and him," he said, with a business-like nod to the Cyclops' broken home. He set off, and after a moment of final consideration, Kendra followed. Adrian trotted after her, holding her sleeve. Caleb set quite as severe a pace on the ground as he did in the branches. He stood waiting impatiently at intervals, beckoning them on into the woods. He spoke little, apparently still brooding heavily on private matters. It was difficult terrain, brambles and thickets impeding their passage between the continual knots of thick trunks. Here and there, stone structures loomed out of the trees, but Caleb led them around, giving them a wide berth. The afternoon drew on, and gloom hung heavier all the while. Kendra could not be certain if Caleb's eyes had regained a faint crimson glow, or if she had merely not seen that glint in the sunlight. Either possibility was especially comforting. Kendra had been warily stumbling for some time. Even with her weeks of walking with the caravan, she was far from hardened to such rough terrain. She did not notice that Caleb had stopped until she walked headlong into his back with a start. For his part, he reacted with little more than a raised eyebrow. "We'll go no further tonight. You look about ready to collapse." She was too winded to protest. "I'll make a fire," she mumbled as she dropped to her knees. Rummaging in his pack, Caleb tossed her a small, handsomely carved tinder box, then paused. "Small and low," he said warningly. Then he slipped away into the darkness. Kendra made her way into a small ditch where the shrubs were not so dense and the light would be veiled from the forest beyond. There were many noises in the deepening evening, many neither recognizable nor comforting. But nothing seemed close, not to her ears at any rate, so she focused on the familiar twinging unpleasantness of starting a fire. At least there was no shortage of kindling strewn about the undergrowth, though not as dry as she might have liked. As she worked, she eventually noticed Adrian kneeling at her shoulder in apparent fascination. He watched intently, eyes bright as the sparks fell into the little nest of fine fibers. Then, with a cry, he lurched back as the flame popped into life. A giggle rose in her throat, but she stifled it. "Don't worry, it's just a fire," she said with a consoling smile. "I don't like it much when they go up all of a sudden like that either." He quickly regained his courage, and before long he was prodding at the fledgling fire with a twig, deeply focused. She grinned fully, as she never would have done if anyone had been watching. The grin was lopsided, drooping at the corner, and she knew that it twisted the scars frighteningly. It was well-trained habit to never smile quite so freely, but just then she was too tired to care. She looked into the middle distance for several moments before, with a sinking feeling, she realized something looked back at her. She froze where she sat, body rigid. "Please do not be alarmed," came a musical voice out of the shadows. "You looked so wonderfully content, we would be ashamed to disturb the two of you." With a small yelp at the sound, Adrian had dropped his glowing, half-burnt stick and shuffled to her side. "Ah, such a handsome couple." A figure stepped into the firelight, barely half her height, but the features not at all childlike. She was hard to make out beyond the flame for the autumn color of her loose-fitting garb, pleasant yellows and oranges, hair a fluttering gold. She smiled apologetically. "I see I have given you a terrible surprise. Please be sure that was not my intention. My friends and I merely were surprised to see transients out in the deep woods, and such uncommonly delightful ones at that." She gestured airily behind her, as several similarly small shapes wandered to the edge of the fire's light. "Might we warm ourselves by the fire with you for a time? There is a bitter chill on the wind this night." Kendra returned an uncertain smile. "Thank you for your kind words," she said automatically, slipping into trained courtesy. She thought hard as to what they might be. Small, doll-like, seemingly friendly, but still clearly sylvan. Pleasantries aside, she was not immediately willing to trust the intentions of these otherworldly beings. But Adrian did not look so frightened now. On the contrary, he had sat up, watching the newcomers with interest. She realized that she had been silent for several long moments, apprehensively appraising. "Of course," she continued graciously, "you are most welcome." Suspicion still prickled at the nape of her neck, but rudeness was unlikely to improve things regardless. The tiny creature clapped her hands brightly, skipping ever so slightly in place. "Oh, thank you. It is a rare pleasure indeed to share an evening with a kind stranger. So many folk in these parts tend towards a most unfriendly disposition." She bowed low with much flourish. "I am Miria, and this is the fairy troop." Drawing closer, 4 figures of similar proportion and disposition, one by one, offered tokens of their appreciation, each more elaborate than the last. The final of the creatures flipped off his feet entirely, almost seeming to float, before dropping down in a crouch, head bowed, arm dramatically cast up at an angle. Kendra stifled a giggle, but the little people looked to each other in delight at the sound. Miria gave the last one a reproving wave of her finger. "That's quite enough showing off now, Jean," she said scoldingly. He shot back a cheeky bow of apology, and she sighed. "Forgive us, please. We are all just excited." "It's quite all right," Kendra smiled warmly now, wariness ebbing quickly. "I am Kendra Aberth of Oakbrook. This is my friend Adrian." His head bobbed cheerily in affirmation. "We're just passing through this land. I hope you'll not take it amiss if I am trespassing." Miria threw back her head and laughed musically. "Trespassing? All this land is the sisters, and anyone else who would dare claim it is brazen indeed. The wood that you burn has fallen from the trees, needed by them no longer. The ground that you sit on is empty. We are free to welcome each other at this good table." "That is a fair-hearted policy. But if I might ask, who are the sisters?" These strangers had an infectious warmth about them, and Kendra found her tongue loosened and her natural curiosity piqued. But her heart quickly plummeted as the question was met with stunned silence. "You told no lie when you said you were not from these parts," Miria said, eyes wide. "For there is nothing that flies, swims, or crawls in the garden, child or ancient, that does not know the touch of the sisters. They are the witch twins, Ilia and Genevieve, and this is their garden." The fairy's tone was reverent, each word weighted with intention and ancient meaning. Then she laughed again. "You poor thing! You must be lost indeed to not know where you are." Kendra bowed her head in embarrassment. "Please forgive my ignorance. Where I am from, this is just the garden." There were other epithets. The garden of monsters, the witchwood, the deathwood. But that would have been rather less than tactful. "This place is considered, a haven for magical beings, but not very much is known of it. Most people avoid it, even the king's men. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that there are certain dangers here." Miria looked confused. "The garden is not dangerous, not to a sensible and respectful lady like yourself. The sisters set it out that way. Though I suppose you must be human." "Yes, I am," Kendra confirmed, a bit bemused. "Why? Do I look like something else?" "We wouldn't know," Miria shrugged. "We've not seen a human in some time. The finer strokes of the portrait begin to blur after a while. Well, at any rate, some might take it poorly for a human to be in the garden, but we shan't hold it against you, nor a spot of ignorance." She snapped her fingers, a twinkle of mirth in her eye. "I know. We can show you. Will you see the troupe perform it? A small dramatization? You might learn much, and it will certainly warm this dark night for all of us." Her smile was back in full force, and she bounced gaily, seeming to hang in the air a half-second longer than expected. Kendra felt a thrill she had thought lost to her. Her breath caught. She was a little girl, tugging at her father's hand on their way to the festival, stories great and small to play out on the stage that was big enough to be its own world. "Thank you," she replied throatily. "That would be most welcome." Miria snapped, and her players blossomed, bursting to life on both sides, framing the fire. The shadows that they cast flickered small, but then each broke into dance, slow and emotive, and around them the shadows on the trunks and the canopy grew in stature and purpose. Kendra and Adrian watched, mirror images of awe. In a quiet voice, half a song, Miria began to chant. The child of iron and child of root, rolling free atop the mossy hill, each bright of voice and swift of foot, each delighting in the other, how their hearts did fill. The fairies danced, out of sync, yet still in a coherent rhythm, an energy that passed from one to the next. But Kendra's eyes were drawn up. The shadows played against the smoke, and strange colors began to resolve more sharply. Two figures flickered in the shifting shadows, one lean and long-limbed in elegant green, and the other strong and stocky, half faded into the gray smoke. They passed around each other, even passing through each other, colors blending momentarily as one. Iron Child was keen and strong in craft. She brought him tools to ease his way. Root Child danced and ever laughed. He passed the spark and lit her day. The muscular figure in the smoke brought down a hammer to a silent anvil, then held up to her friend a circlet, beautifully defined silver. With a gracious bow, the tall green figure slipped it round his neck, and, as his hand rested on his breast, he pulled away a piece of himself, a wisp of the barest glow of his verdant essence. Kendra stared unblinking, her mouth agape, her heart full of quiet wonder. Of two worlds were they, but stood as one. A time as partners waned too soon. Iron Child grew many under the sun. Root Child danced alone beneath the moon. The smoke grew and spread out across the roof of the clearing, ranks upon ranks of gray figures, with the spark of green in their eyes passing around each other, their friend a wayward smear of color in their stony sea. And beside him, one form began to grow darker, resolute. A queen cruel of fist and hard of heart, giving naught but death, she only took. An iron queen bearing iron dart, the ancient roots were all forsook. Smoke given form, almost real, a helmeted woman stood at the center of it all, watching the child of Root's ephemeral form. She was mighty, in command, and as she lifted her arm, the gray figures buffeted against him on all sides, their green eyes winking out as they did, until they were all gone. The queen was close at hand, and as his delicate form cowered, she bent down and tore the silver circlet from his throat. It was the reclamation, Kendra dimly registered in a small, detached corner of her mind. She felt the tears roll down her cheeks unbidden as her emotions cascaded to a feverish pitch, a kind of ecstasy burning in her as she beheld this ancient conflict legend come alive. The sisters will last among their kind, last daughters unhardened by metal ways. Their garden is opened, and all may find safe loam for roots till end of days. A final pair of green-eyed figures passed out of the gray, and they bore the child of Root away. The queen drew a sword, pursuing with great speed, but the sisters each raised a hand, and there was a great churning as attackers of smoke were dispersed, shapes and colors all swirling in a chaotic vortex. When at last it settled, there was no more green. The sisters had gone, their charge with them. The queen floated alone in the darkness, shaking until she tore her helmet off. Her face was a rictus of rage, a silent shriek, terrible to behold. But Kendra knew that gruesome twist of the features, that rippling, uneven expanse of ruined skin, and she was screaming also now as she looked into the mirror of her own face, the haunted eyes burning with denial and despair to be so alone, to have lost all. The smoke rolled up into the night sky, the illusory images gone. Near at hand there was the sound of retching, a sour smell on the air. The fire was mostly embers now, and she blinked dazedly. She had stoked it to a fair blaze just before her strange guests had arrived. Indeed, there was the barest glimmer of pale light in the sky. Night was passing, and fatigue weighed heavily on her, battling her lurching stomach. She turned her head about blurrily. Adrian was at her side, joy fading as he stared. She followed his gaze. The fairies were haggardly arrayed about the dying fire, some helping others to their feet. Pools of sick were splashed about in places. Miria met her eyes, shaking with incomprehension and horror.
"Can you not even look on the visage of your own kind? What manner of sad creature are you? What is wrong with you?"
"I'm sorry. I don't understand. Please, let me help." Kendra rose, but Miria stepped back fearfully. She threw her fist up, then down in a flash, and something flew into the fire. An eruption of acrid smoke billowed up, leaving Adrian and Kendra coughing and waving their arms to clear it away. When the burning had gone from their eyes, the two were alone again. "I see you managed to make some friends while I was away." Kendra spun to see Caleb at the edge of the clearing, a small basket in his lap, leaning comfortably against a tree.
"Caleb!" she exclaimed. "What happened? I think I lost track of time. Were you delayed?"
He shrugged. "I've been back for some time. There's dinner, when you'd like it. Well, breakfast now. But at any rate, you looked like you were quite busy, so I waited." Kendra frowned, rubbing her eyes, images still lingering sickeningly. So the whole night was gone. Small wonder she was exhausted.
"I didn't think they would keep me busy all night. It didn't feel like it was all that long."
"Yes, fairy performances can be quite enthralling, as you've discovered. Well, they have to be. It's how the fairy folk eat. Jubilation, excitement, all those sorts of emotional highs. They delight their audience and gorge themselves on it. It can be quite taxing for a mortal audience, perilous even. The fae rarely pay much attention to the time. You might have sat watching that performance for a very long while indeed."
"Oh my! Well, I guess it turned out all right in the end, though I'm not entirely sure why."
"They don't remember what humans look like anymore. They assumed that your face was a typical frame of reference when they wove their illusion. When you got upset, you quite spoiled their meal. They're quite literally in your head for the duration of that experience, feeling everything with you. They aim to please, but it would seem they rather missed the mark." There was a brief pause, but Caleb still glowered. "But that wasn't quite what I'd hoped you'd take away from this. In the hour I was gone, you got yourself into a potentially lethal situation. I'd hoped that by leaving you to stew in it a while, you might find it painfully instructional. You can't be this trusting." She waved her hand placatingly. "That's a little extreme, don't you think? A bit of an overreaction. I'm fine, just tired. They left on their own. And from what you said, they never meant any harm to start with. I don't think they realized that it would be too much for me. It didn't seem proper to just turn them away." "Does that make it all right for them to hurt you?" he snapped. "A blizzard will freeze you dead without you ever noticing. Ignorance doesn't matter. Intention doesn't matter. You'll still be just as dead. You have to look out for yourself. You have to be the one to care." Kendra almost snapped back at the rebuke, but she paused. Caleb's face was distant, unconcerned, but his breast rose and fell heavily, the muscles of his neck taut. She moderated her tone, speaking slowly, soothingly. "I appreciate you looking out for me. Thank you. I wasn't as cautious as I could have been, and I will be more careful." She patted him on the shoulder, and he tensed like a spring, but after a moment he relaxed and grunted his acceptance, averting his mollified gaze. "Come on. You should get some rest after having spent all night watching over me. I'm glad I can trust you," she said, with a smile that was ever so slightly teasing. He sighed and thrust the basket into her hands. It was laden with berries, nuts, and mushrooms, not all of them immediately recognizable. "We can't afford to waste daylight. Just a few hours before we start again. Try not to sleep in any fairy vomit," he grumbled, before stalking off to find a suitably comfortable patch of grass. She snorted lightly, then turned to Adrian. "How are you doing, little friend?" He nodded his head solemnly, eyes distant and thoughtful.
"Liked them,"
he murmured quietly. Kendra puffed a laugh that was half a sigh. "Yes, I suppose I did too. I guess they didn't like me very much." She popped a berry glumly into her mouth out of the basket before blinking in shock. Its taste was clear and sharp, bright and absolutely alive, and she grabbed another before pushing the basket towards Adrian. "Come on, you need to eat too. We've got to keep your strength up, particularly if you're going to keep pulling the kind of heroics you did today." He ate eagerly and with no further prompting, and she felt a pang of guilt. When was the last time he had eaten? He paused, mouth and hands thinly smeared in juices, and offered her back the basket, as well as a small smile. She thought it might have been the first one she'd seen on his face.
"Like you,"
he said, earnestly and easily. Kendra swallowed a lump. "Thanks, Adrian," she managed. "I like you too." They ate quietly together in the biting cold of the pre-dawn, and then laid down side by side, fading into shared oblivion with the last of the stars.